Our next presenter today is going to be Bonnie Kelley. She's a wildlife inspector with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and today she'll be talking about a wildlife inspector's expertise in animal transportation. Please put your hands together for Bonnie.
All righty. Hello, everyone. As was said, I'm Wildlife Inspector Bonnie Kelley. I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Today, I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about what inspectors do. What does animal transport look like for us? What regulations we're looking at? And generally what we do for an inspection. As many of you know, a lot of animals on the planet are faced with either being listed as endangered or threatened, and this is off of the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act was finalized in 1973, and the point of it was to try and protect wildlife and from things going extinct. Along with helping to protect wildlife, it set a lot of precedents and regulations for what I do. A lot of my work is directly dictated by what's written in the Endangered Species Act. In my line of work, we do interdict illegally traded wildlife as well as trafficked wildlife. My position is to try and stop that. Again, I work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I'm a little bit different than what usually people think of as a fish and wildlife person. Oftentimes people think, oh, fish and wildlife, you're in the woods, in the prairie, you're studying bugs on the ground. I'm a little bit different. Again, I work at an airport, and my position is stationed at all of the major ports of entry. So again, we are under Fish and Wildlife Service, and we are our own branch for the Office of Law Enforcement. This graph isn't everything. It's just to give you guys an idea of where we fall kind of in that pyramid scheme of the federal government. We're down here. We work very closely with the special agents. The special agents tend to handle a lot of domestic cases as well as international cases, whereas the wildlife inspectors are primarily at those ports of entry. So again, I'm a wildlife inspector. So what does that mean? What do I do? These are all examples of some things that we're up to in the field. So we conduct inspections of shipments that are coming into the country, what we call imports, and shipments that are leaving the country, to which we call exports. We ensure compliance with federal, state, and foreign laws. Again, some of those federal laws are things like the Endangered Species Act. As far as state and foreign laws, we do enforce those as well. The Lacey Act is a really great law that we have that allows us to enforce something that either the state requires or restricts, or a foreign country restricts or requires. So if a foreign country, for example, doesn't want a certain animal exported, we can enforce that and say, nope, no exports of that animal because this country doesn't want those leaving. And again, that's under the Lacey Act. We combat wildlife trafficking. We are at the ports of entry, so when shipments come in, we are looking at those shipments. If something's undeclared, being smuggled, being trafficked, we will interdict those. And we like to do a lot of education with the trade communities, so that would be like you guys, and the general public. We often do like school talks or like the Dallas Safari Club, we're present there. Sometimes folks don't know that we exist. And sometimes folks don't know that there are requirements for wildlife. Certain permits you have to have, certain licensing you have to have, certain declarations you have to have. So for us, we break ports of entry into two categories: designated ports and non-designated ports. For designated ports, with proper permitting and licensing, you can import anything from anywhere. There are no restrictions on what that animal is or the location of where it is coming from or going to. At non-designated ports, we have restrictions for what wildlife is allowed in because it has to be from certain countries, or we have a designated port exemption permit. So that permit is very, very specific, and that says which ports of entry. In a lot of emergency animal transport cases, we can issue designated port exemption permits. So if there is an emergency where an animal is coming into some tiny port in the middle of the US that's usually not a designated port, we can issue a permit to allow them to use that port in case of emergencies. Designated ports also, scientific institutions, we have different categories for why someone might use those. but that is a permit we issue. So what types of wildlife or methods do people use to import different shipments of wildlife? Passenger. I work at the airport, so a lot of what we see is terminal passengers, people coming in from vacations, people moving here, they're flying in and just coming through a regular commercial airline as a passenger. We also have the land borders. A lot of people drive across the land borders if they're coming from Mexico or Canada, and we're stationed at those land borders as well, looking at people importing wildlife. Another method is the mail. People don't often think of animals being shipped through the mail, but it does happen. It is legal, again, as long as you have your declarations, your permit, your licensing, whatever requirements that there are, you have to meet those, but the mail is an option to send wildlife. And cargo, a lot of shipments, most commercial shipments, most large shipments will come through some form of cargo. The majority of imports that come into the US in general, not necessarily wildlife, but all imports come through ocean cargo. Another really big one is through air cargo. I'm sure some of you have had animals shipped in or flown an animal for one reason or another into or out of the US. That would be your air cargo. We also do have buses and rail. Those tend to be a little less common with live wildlife just because it takes a little bit longer for those shipments to come through, but we do have those. So what is regulated wildlife? We use the term wildlife a lot. What does that actually mean? For Fish and Wildlife Service, what I do, it's a little easier to tell people what isn't wildlife than what is wildlife. Generally speaking, wildlife is anything that's alive, dead, a part, or a finished product of something. So that can be your live pet you're importing, all the way down to a brand new pair of exotic Italian shoes made of an exotic leather. What we don't regulate is domestic stock. So if you think of your farm animals, your pigs, chickens, horses, sheep, we don't regulate those as long as it's domestic. The exception to that, though, is that if something comes from a wild strain or a CITES protected animal and is hybridized, we do still regulate that even if it's, say, 15 generations down the line. An example of this that we get questioned a lot about is the Bengal cats or hybrid cats. These are hybridized with caracal cats, and caracals are protected by CITES. So if you're only a couple generations into breeding your pet cat, it's still protected by CITES. So you actually need a CITES permit on top of your declaration and everything to import that cat. If it is, say, 15 generations bred in, you may no longer need the CITES permit, but you still have to declare it because it's still regulated wildlife for Fish and Wildlife. So wild hybrids are still regulated. Types of live animal shipments that we see. We see a lot for the commercial pet trade. An example would be like aquarium fish that are coming in for a pet store. We see a lot of those, especially here at DFW. Personal pets, if somebody is importing, say, their pet iguana, and they either went on vacation or they're moving to the States, something like that, they might bring their live pet in for that. Zoos, a lot of you guys, like I said, you're very familiar with importing animals. If you guys need a certain animal or looking to get a certain animal, you might import for that reason. Scientific institutions. A lot of times scientific institutions will have either interchange programs where they'll ship animals to one another from foreign countries to the US, or they might go collect something in the wild. When they import that, they'll have to go through us. Breeding and genetic programs, very similar to scientific institutions, same thing. If they're bringing it in to increase that genetic pool, or they want to have a stash of a certain animal so that if that animal does become extinct, they have some genetic material left of it, those animals have to go through the Fish and Wildlife inspection process. State and country relocations. An example that I have for this is when I worked in Arizona. So I'm here at DFW now, but I was in Arizona on the southern border for a few years before this. And one of the programs we had was pronghorn antelope that we would interchange with Mexico. Mexico would send us some, we would send them some. And we would work very closely with the state agencies and the Mexican officials to be able to transport these animals. Another example of state country relocation, is here in El Paso, we have wolves, and there's an interchange program for the wolves as well. Smuggled wildlife. So unfortunately, another aspect of seeing live wildlife is smuggled wildlife. So the first example I have up here is a snake that's been stuffed with narcotics. Unfortunately, people tend to use scary animals, such as venomous reptiles, to conceal or prevent people from wanting to find illegal substances, whether that be narcotics, stashes of money, things like that. So we have had cases where wildlife has been used to either smuggle it, as in it's inside the animal, which was the case with this boa, there were narcotics in it, or to try and prevent, say, customs from taking a look at that because no one wants to deal with a spooky animal. Another type of smuggled wildlife that we run into is body carried wildlife. The picture here is a pair of pants. These are a fake pair of pants, kind of like an apron, and there are pockets in it. And there are fish that are stashed in all these pockets. So he was wearing these thinking he wouldn't be caught. The bottom photo here is toilet paper tubes. And in those toilet paper tubes are songbirds. We get a lot of smuggled body carried songbirds. They tend to be pretty small, so people will put them in toilet paper tubes. I have a picture of another case we had in a couple slides, and people will body carry those. And body carrying can happen anywhere. It can happen through the land border. It can happen on an airplane. It can happen in a truck if someone is hiding in a truck. And then another example I have here are parrots inside this car seat. So this was coming up from Mexico into the US, and they had stashed all of these parrots for the illegal pet trade in their car. And again, the thought was that you wouldn't find them because they're concealed. So these are all examples of smuggling. Regulations. My job is to do a lot of compliance work, making sure that the regulations are being met and to facilitate the legal trade. To do that, we have a whole slew of different laws and acts that we follow. The first one I have listed here, Endangered Species Act. That one regulates just about every animal you can import. That is what our declaration requirements are based on, and that is what some of our very basic transport notification of live animals coming through, what you can and can't bring through, such as the endangered species list, those threatened and endangered animals. That's all in the Endangered Species Act. The other big one is CITES. I know a lot of you are familiar with this. The CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. For us, if it's CITES listed coming into or out of the US, it will require a permit of some sort. So if you're importing something, for example, you may be required to have a foreign CITES permit. Or if you're exporting something, you may be required to have a US export permit. In some cases, you might even be required to have both. So it's very dependent on what that animal is, and it's very dependent on what your appendix listing is. The third one I have up at the top here is the Lacey Act. Again, the Lacey Act is what lets us enforce state and foreign laws. It's also got a few basic transport requirements, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. The bottom cluster are very specific. And again, this is not all of the laws. These are just some of the more common ones that we use on a daily basis. Some of these may apply to your shipment. Some of them might not apply to your shipment. Marine Mammal Protection Act, for example. If you're importing something that is not a marine mammal, it's not likely that that law is going to apply to you. Vice versa, if it's not a migratory bird that you're importing, it might not apply to you. So being specific and knowing exactly what you're importing is really important for us. And that helps us determine what regulations, what set we're looking at. All right, basic transporting requirements. As I said, the Lacey Act helps us with the state and foreign policy. It also helps us with some basic requirements that we end up docking people a lot on because they're not following. These apply to almost all shipments, CITES regardless, ESA regardless. So one of them is the marking of containers. I know we've already talked a little bit about marking, but it's really, really, really important because if a cardboard box comes in and it's not labeled, I'm gonna not know what's in there. The airline's not gonna know what's in there. And there's a high likelihood of injury or mortality if there's an animal in there because nobody's gonna know what it is. So at very minimum, those live animals or live wildlife stickers with like this way up, those are super important. The other thing that Fish and Wildlife is looking for is consignee and consignor information. So who's the shipper, who's the importer? And the third sort of component to that is what's in the box. You may have an import-export license for your business. And if that's the case, putting your Fish and Wildlife import-export license on that box tells us that that is the shipment that we're looking for. The other way you can do it is have what is in the box listed. So that would be the genus and species name and then the quantity. So that, again, we know exactly what's in that box. The other component to the Lacey Act requirement is the humane and healthful transport. This has very basic information on what your carrier should look like, what the temperature should be. If you don't follow these, again, there's a very high likelihood of injury or mortality to your live animal. So again, this is the Lacey Act part. This applies to just about every single live import, regardless of CITES listing and ESA listing. IATA or AIDA, a lot of people have talked about this. Some of you are very familiar with this book. I would highly recommend you check this out before you plan any shipment of a live animal. This book is incredibly specific, and it's based on a lot of the CITES regulations. So if it's CITES listed, it has to follow the requirements in this book. If it's not CITES listed, we highly recommend you follow these because these are solid for animal transport. All right, Big Cat Public Safety Act. So the list I have on the side are all the animals, the common names, some of the common names for the species that are listed under this act. And the reason why I want to bring this act up is because it's very new. So this act was finalized in December of last year. It amends the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, and there was a requirement that you have to register with Fish and Wildlife Service before June. The goal of this act was to end the private ownership of big cats as pets and reduce the exposure of the general public by exhibitors to big cats, and it includes cubs. We're all familiar with that Joe Exotic case. This sort of came out of that. We want to reduce the risk to the general public of wild big cats. Under this act, we have prohibited activities. So without registering with Fish and Wildlife Service or having the appropriate USDA license and certification, all of these acts are prohibited. And again, this is very new. This came out last December. All right, so elements for importing and exporting. I talk a lot about imports. We tend to get more imports than exports, but the import and export process is very similar. So providing your designated port 48 hours prior notice. For non-designated, that's 72. That 48 hours allows us to be aware of what shipment is coming in, arrange for inspection, and make sure that we have the proper staffing. A U.S. Fish and Wildlife Declaration form. This form is required for all live animals, regardless of CITES, regardless of ESA listing. You have to have a declaration for it. If it's a personal pet, you have to have a declaration for it. A declaration form is our who, what, where, when, how. It's very similar to like a customs import document, but this is specifically for fish and wildlife and regulated wildlife that's coming in or leaving the country. It'll say who the importer is, where that animal is going to. It will list the genus and species names, the quantities, and the source of where that wildlife is from. So these forms are very specific and have to be filled out for every live animal shipment. Accompanying documentation. We really want to see any tracking that you have, if that's an airway bill, if that's a truck number, an invoice, a packing list, health certificates, and any of your permitting. If there's a license, we need that license to be current. If you have a permit, we need that permit to be valid. There's also user fees that are sometimes associated with live animal shipments. Those appropriate user fees have to be paid. Compliance with the marking requirements, again, under the Lacey Act. If nobody knows what's in your box, there's a good chance that box is not going to make it to you in good condition and that animal's still going to be alive. Humane and healthful transport, same thing. If it's not being properly taken care of, there's a high risk of mortality. And compliance with CITES, if you have that permit has to be valid, and that container that it's in has to follow those IATA standards. Highly, highly recommend reaching out to your nearest wildlife inspector office. Even if you guys are contemplating shipping an animal and just don't really know all the logistics yet, go ahead and reach out to us. Because the other thing is we can guide you and tell you if there's a permit you may have overlooked. And again, we've heard this morning, permits take time to get. So it's best to know that you need a permit in advance rather than when that animal is being arranged for shipment. All right, so this is a general overview of the inspection process. The example I have given is a penguin here that's coming off of an airline. This is an import, but again, our import and export process is very, very similar. So when we're conducting our inspection, the first thing that we want to see is that you have your license and all your permits obtained. Any permits that you have to get, if that's a state restricted wildlife permit even, we want to make sure that you have that in advance. Give us that 48 hours prior notice. If you guys know more than 48 hours, go ahead and let us know then. If you know a month in advance, that's even better, because then we can make sure that everything's arranged before anything has been set yet. But at a minimum, 48 hours is required. And that's a designated port, 72 for the non-designated. Declaration and documentation. One way that a lot of folks submit that declaration to us and all of our documentation that we require is through our electronic declaration system, or EDEX. Some of you may be familiar with using an EDEC. Some of you may have never done a declaration before because you don't import stuff. That's okay. And some of you may use brokers for this process. The brokers can file on your behalf as well. By using that electronic declaration system, again, you can upload all of your documentation right to it and pay your user fees. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for everything that we require. When the animal actually arrives, the day that it arrives, the plane comes in, it gets offloaded from the plane, usually into a warehouse. Rare circumstances, it is the tarmac. And we, the wildlife inspectors, will travel to wherever that animal is being offloaded to, wherever that stopping place is. So if that's the warehouse, we'll travel to the warehouse to go meet it. The first thing we're looking for is that all the enclosure requirements are met, so that the container is compliant with the IATA requirements, as well as your labeling. So we are looking for that live animal, the consignor information, and what's in it. The next thing we're going to look for is making sure that whatever you said you're bringing in is actually what you said you're bringing in. We understand mix-ups do occur, but for the most part, what you've declared to us is what we are expecting to see. All right, so then if everything goes well, we'll give you guys clearance. You may also receive CDC or USDA clearance, or get signed off on all your certificates. That you'll then receive a clearance by customs, and customs will release that shipment. And then it's either ready for pickup or it's ready to go to its quarantine facility. Many of us know that there's quarantine processes that are either required by CDC or USDA, or there's ones that we have at our own facility. At that point, those can begin. Failure to meet standards. So if an import is coming in and something is wrong with it, there is action that we will take. The first one is that we might refuse your clearance altogether. We might say, nope, you can't get clearance for this. This is not coming in this manner. It could be ordered re-exported, sent back to where it was coming from. We can seize that animal. We have the, if we seize something, we will either issue you an abandonment form, and if the abandonment form isn't signed, we will go through a civil forfeiture proceeding. So the animal can get seized regardless of if you voluntarily abandon it to us. Monetary penalties. There are monetary penalties with some of these violations. These have been set forth in the laws themselves. So we can write you guys a fine for it. You can lose your license. If you have an import-export license, we can revoke it. If the offense is really egregious, we can revoke it right then. The other way we can revoke licenses or remove them is to not let you renew it. So when your license is up, we might say, nope, you can't renew it. Too many violations. You can also lose your permits. We can cancel permits on you. Even if you have it validated, if there's something wrong with it, we can say, nope, canceled permit. We can also not issue permits. So if you're like, oh, I really want to export this, CITES listed, say rhino, we can go, nope, we're not going to issue your permit. So aside from the importer penalties, there are animal penalties too. A lot of you guys are probably aware of these, but stress, injury, and death, this can always occur in your shipments. When I worked in Arizona, these are actually photos from one of the cases that I had. These were chinchillas that were coming up from Mexico. Keep in mind, this is Arizona, and this is Arizona in the summer. If you guys know chinchillas, you know they are incredibly temperature sensitive. And there are very few animals in general that should be coming through the border in a vehicle through the Arizona summer. The van that they were coming in was just a passenger van with really poor insulation. So the example that I have here shows a lot of the points from lack of water. So the water system that they had rigged up was these little plastic tubes. There was no dripper on the end, and there was no good water source that they could connect to these tubes. So they claimed they had a water system, but it was just a 5-gallon bucket of water and no real way to connect these tubes up. The other thing is heat and cold can be super stressors on these animals. Again, these were chinchillas coming through in the Arizona summer. Noise. It is incredibly loud in warehouses. I have been in a number of warehouses when a forklift drops a pallet and you can feel how loud it is. So noise can really affect these animals coming in. Other animals. So in the photo down here, these two chinchillas are very, very close to each other in a cage that has very large mesh. If an animal sticks its paw through, another animal could bite it, could scratch it. And we all know that bites and scratches can lead to infection, bacterial exposure, and ultimately it can lead to fatalities. Crushing and suffocating. If these containers aren't appropriate, these were guinea pigs, and the guinea pigs containers were made out of these very flimsy plastic bins. And what was happening was they were stacked so high that the bottom bin was starting to get crushed. So the animal can actually be crushed if the enclosure isn't proper. Unkept cages. The cages were very, very dirty when they came through, and a lot of this wiring was very rusty and very sharp. And again, if animals get poked, scratched, scraped, that can lead to mortality. Disease transfer. We talked a little bit about the non-human primate stuff, but in general, animals can carry a number of diseases and they can spread it to each other. Again, these chinchillas are nose to nose between this. If one of them is sick, unhealthy, has some sort of virus, it can easily spread that to the others. The other thing is disease risk to myself and to the airline staff. Injury to inspector. Injury to inspector, but not only the inspector, but the airline staff again. If the cage or enclosure doesn't have proper spacer bars or handholds, and we go and try and pick something up, if it's sharp, we can cut ourselves and we can get an infection or disease from that animal. Help us help them. So again, contact your local Fish and Wildlife office. You can speak to a special agent if you think something weird domestically is happening, or if you know or hear of something that you're like, I don't know if that should be happening, that's being an imported or exported, let us know. The other thing is when we do have these seizures, oftentimes there are large quantities of animals coming in and we don't always have the resources to be able to take care of these in our offices. Again, I work at the airport. If a shipment of 200 birds for whatever reason comes in and there's something wrong with it, thankfully we have USDA. But if tarantulas come in, what am I going to do with 2,000 tarantulas? Here we had a shipment of tarantulas that were being illegally smuggled in through the mail. So this is a pair of sneakers and the pair of sneakers was being shipped in the mail, and in the pair of sneakers are stuffed these little tiny plastic vials, and in each of these vials was a baby tarantula. So these were for the illegal pet trade. Same with these birds here. These are all in hair curlers, and the hair curlers have like nets over them, and the little birds are just stuffed into the hair curlers. We had a shipment of primates. These are spider monkeys here. These ones were being driven up from the from Mexico into the US across the southern border, just in someone's bag in their back seat. And then the bottom picture here, a baby tiger in a suitcase. So these are all examples of being smuggled. And we work with a lot of other people, especially when we're doing these inspections. So as we talked about, there are a number of different other agencies that are interested in some of these shipments. For non-human primate, you're definitely going to have the CDC involved. For bird shipments, you're definitely going to have USDA involved. So we work hand in hand with a lot of these. USDA, CDC, and CBP, they're all present the same time I'm present while doing these physical inspections. NOAA and the state agencies, we often do operations with them if there's special shipments that are coming in that are of interest to either of them, or sometimes they'll just do proactive inspections with us. And the airlines, we work incredibly closely with the airlines. Again, I'm stationed at the airport, so the airline staff are folks that I work with every day. All right, so I'm Wildlife Inspector Bonnie Kelley again. I want to thank you guys so much for having me, for listening, to coming to this. If we have questions, I'd like to take some at this time.
All right, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. If you have a question, you're attending virtually, please put it in the Q&A, and Karen will ask your questions in session.
All right, I have one question. You have shown a lot of great examples of illegal trade and smuggling. How often are these examples happening? Is it every day, every week, every month? How frequently does this happen?
There's kind of, I guess, two ways to answer that. So nationally, I mean, we have illegal shipments every day that come in. Super smuggled cases, like some of the examples I've shown, they're not as common. We don't see those every day, but they happen pretty frequently. And we're across the whole nation. So while DFW here in Texas might not see a smuggled case, anything to the level of this for quite some time, there might be a couple that happen on the southern border. And then there might be one that happens here and nothing on the southern border for a while. So they are not uncommon. But they're not common per port. Does that if that makes sense? But again, there's little seizures too that happen that aren't, the caliber of some of the photos are pretty extreme. Obviously, if a shipment of spider monkeys comes in someone's purse, that doesn't happen every day. But to have a marking violation, that happens quite often.
Okay, there's a question over there, Chad.
Yes, I'm curious how many designated ports of entry you have.
We have a good amount of them. Off the top of my head, I don't know how many. But if you think of all like major ports that you would think of as international ports, so JFK, here, Houston, LA, Atlanta, yeah. So if you think generally of like major ports of entry, those are often designated ports.
So like CDC has like 18 that have CDC people there. You would have a lot more than that? Than 18?
It varies by port. So our staffing is usually based on the number of imports or exports. So one designated port might have a couple people, another might have like 10. So it varies a lot by port.
My next question is about the big Cat Safety Act.
Yes.
They had until June 18 to register.
Yes.
You have about how many people registered by then?
The goal was to have everyone who owns a big cat in some capacity to be registered. I don't know the numbers. They aren't registered with the inspectors. But if anybody needs more information as to who to contact with that, I can provide some. The primary folks would be our special agents at the moment. to figure out who to get registered with and all that.
Was that the permit office that registration went through, like Arlington?
Probably, I don't know the answer to that one, but it's probably the permits office.
Okay, I have a couple of short ones and a longer one. Are songbirds smuggled primarily for pets?
People smuggle animals for a lot of different reasons. The majority of smuggling cases we have, I want to say, are for monetary gain. The premise of how they get that money can come in a lot of different ways. There's trading, bartering that happens. We do have illegal pet trade is one of our big targets because people like having weird, unusual pets, and they'll pay a lot of money for it. So yes and no.
What are the designated Wisconsin ports?
I would have to look that one up. If you guys are interested in where those wildlife inspection ports are, I put links in the Whova app, but I'm not sure if you guys have access to those links or not.
They do have access if they're online, they can scroll all the way down underneath where the Zoom links are to the event, and all of the attachments are there. If you are in session here, if you download the Whova app, you can also have that same access. You go into the session and you scroll all the way down, and all the attachments are also there. All right,
So-
we have one.
Yeah.
We have one right here for a question.
What is staffing like for the inspectors at the non-designated ports? Is it very slim, or, do you have to plan something very far in advance?
That was non-designated ports, correct? Yeah. So the 72 hours is mandatory. And oftentimes that's because we have kind of two categories of non-designated ports. We have staffed and non-staffed designated ports. When I worked in Arizona, some of our non-designated ports were like Douglas, Arizona, and I would have to travel from Nogales to Douglas to anticipate a shipment. So that's part of why that notice is given. So sometimes there is an inspector, or there's an inspector a few hours away. So that's why that 72 is so important, is because oftentimes we have to travel for those non-designated ports.
Okay, Karen, do we have any additional questions?
Is the process change being implemented for seized wildlife placed with others pending litigation? Historically, those providing temporary care were issued a chain of custody form.
Yes. Can you repeat the question again?
Has a process changed, been implemented for the seized wildlife placed with others pending litigation?
If something's pending litigation, we will opt not to. We have temporary housing, and then we have like rehoming. We'll rehome with different certified facilities, or we might repatriate something. I know that we've repatriated some animals back to the foreign countries before. For temporary care and housing, it can be harder sometimes to find animals, because a lot of times I'll call up our facility and be like, hey, are you available like right now? I'm looking at a shipment of whatever. But again, if we know that there's a pending litigation or something has come up, we will try not to use those facilities. They usually have to be certified, and that's either by us that we're working on right now, or by some like AZA or ZA, some sort of certification.
Okay, do we have any additional questions in here? Chad, you have one?
Hi,
Hello.
thank you so much for coming. That was an amazing presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Really enjoyed it. So I work a lot with Fish and Wildlife in Seattle. One of the things I struggle with is when I have those like kind of odd, personal pet, one rabbit. First I have to figure out, which kind of rabbit it is, and, go down that rabbit hole, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the other thing I struggle with is like, guinea pigs or hamsters.
Yep.
And so I always go to the Title 50
Yep.
and try to read through, but a lot of times it's not listed there, or it's really unclear. Is there like a better resource? Or, I always bug my local Fish and Wildlife. Like I call them, I have, text them, whatever.
Yeah.
But I just feel like sometimes I wish I could do a little bit more of the research on my own.
Yeah, of course.
Do you have some like good resources besides Title 50, which is I mean, I pulled it up just now. I was looking at it while you were doing it. It's so vague.
Yeah, no. The short answer to that is no. I would really say reach out to your wildlife inspection office because they're going to be the ones who know. And so what she's talking about for folks that may not know is our Title 50 is our CFR. So that's our Code of Federal Regulation. That is exactly what dictates what I do. And that falls under the Endangered Species Act. That Title 50, if you folks are interested in looking at it, you can find it online. And there is a section that explicitly says what animals are not regulated. And again, the list can be a little bit vague because it'll say like ducks, domestic stock. So I would definitely clarify with your Fish and Wildlife office, reach out to your inspectors and clarify with them, because if you think you have a domestic animal and it turns out, oh, this isn't quite as domestic as I thought it was, you don't want to have that animal show up and the inspector be like, this is not what we talked about. So check with your inspection office. You can, yeah, get started maybe by looking at that Title 50, but then follow up with your inspecting office.
Awesome. Karen,
Those
do
are
you
really
have
good
any more questions?
Is there a way to get the correct information on approved crates for birds?
The IATA book, I would say check with the IATA book. If you're unclear, you can check with us too, and check with USDA. USDA does a lot of bird regulations. So if you're looking for what kind of container do I need? How do I make sure that it's up to code? Check with us, check with USDA, and check that IATA book.
Okay, do we have any additional hands up over here for any questions in person? We have one right here.
Hi, so we're in DFW and we had a couple of years ago, some foxes came through that were being brought into the country for, it wasn't our shipment, but they were being brought in to be domestic pets.
Yep.
And in Texas, you can't have foxes as domestic pets. That's what we were told, and we took them and helped rehome them. Because the breeder didn't want them back. But my question is that different from state to state? And does Fish and Wildlife regulate that from state to state? So if they had gone into Florida, could they have gone in and been pets?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. So it does vary state to state. So your state regulations, as far as what we're doing under that Lacey Act, is just as important as the other regulations. So that's a great example. If someone's flying in a pet into Texas and they're not supposed to have that pet per Texas state regulations, we can say no. But say that pet is allowed in Seattle and Seattle doesn't have a problem with you having it as a pet. They can import it into Seattle and have it in Seattle, but it can't come into Texas. So it does vary state by state.
Oh, we couldn't have cleared it in Texas and sent it to Seattle.
We have very specific in-transit regulations. So what you're talking about is an in-transit shipment. And that is, again, state by state. So if the state says, nope, we don't want any risk of it escaping, we don't want any risk of it being here, then you can't import it. If a state will issue you an in-transit permit, sometimes that might be something that you could use in order to get that shipment imported into Dallas, but then sent to Seattle, something like that.
Okay, Karen, any additional questions?
What are your capabilities for caring for wildlife while you sort out your concerns for permits and transportation problems? Do you have animal care staff?
We are trained in basic animal husbandry, and some of us have more experience than others. So it depends on what that animal is, and it depends on the experience of the staff in that office. I know El Paso, for example, we have one of the best guys for tarantulas you would ever need. So if tarantula shipments come in, he is the one to contact about how to take care of it, and they can house them in their office, no problem. If a giant shipment of tarantulas comes in through DFW, I'm not as familiar with tarantula husbandry and care, so I might reach out to one of our certified facilities. So it depends on the resources that office has. Do we have even space for it at all? And then depends on the knowledgeability of our staff, and it varies from port to port.
Okay, we have an additional question right here.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Bonnie. I'm Elizabeth, and I just wanted to really thank everything that the wildlife inspectors do. The only way we can deny a license as of currently,
Oh,
the
okay.
most positive way is by endangered species and how we can go on. And when we know someone has, for broad purposes, trafficked,
Mhm.
it's the instant way. We don't need to go through litigation or administrative complaint. So when those are filed and those happen, all of the work that the ports do, that helps us so much, keeping licenses out of hands that are doing illegal trafficking, because that impact on welfare for animals for years to come is unfathomable. So it makes a difference to us in enforcement. So thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks for being here, Elizabeth.
Karen, any additional questions?
How related are the drug cartels to illegal smuggling of animals?
Very. We have a lot of cases that end up spiraling. And this is part of the reason why we work so closely. One group of folks that I haven't mentioned, kind of partnering with Customs and us is HSI. There's a lot of cases, like I said, that spiral. We'll end up catching them on a wildlife violation, and then we'll be like, oh, wait a second, this other component, whether it's money or drugs or substances they're not supposed to have, so we'll get a lot of other agencies involved, and super illegally smuggled wildlife has a direct connection to things like the cartels.
Okay, do we have any additional questions in session? Karen, we probably have time for one more if you have one.
So this is a follow-up to the question about the bird crates. The individual is asking, how do they find out why a crate was not approved? So they're bringing in crates from overseas. The overseas crates are not meeting standards, but they're not being given specific information on that.
So the simplest way for me to put that, obviously some of these instances can be very complex, and depending on what you're importing is very, very, very specific. So if you're importing a CITES listed bird versus a non-CITES bird versus like a penguin versus a raptor, these are going to vary greatly. But so the most general way of putting it is that for Fish and Wildlife Service, the way we regulate it is it's the importer's responsibility to know what's going on. So if you are an importer and you get something from a company overseas and they send it in and the crate looks like rubbish, nothing is marked, the cage is broken, say the animal even escapes, unfortunately, it's the importer's responsibility. So with that said, enforcement action is on the importer of record. Very few cases do we have an import-export license that is actually issued to a foreign national. We do have that sometimes, but for the most part, it's going to be that US entity. So whoever is the importer of record or the exporter of record, if it's an exported shipment, it's going to be their responsibility. And again, so make sure you know what your shipment looks like coming in. If that crate doesn't meet regulations, if half the animals are dead, it is your fault.
And we did have one more virtual question
Yeah.
come in that we do have time for, so we'll take it, Karen.
Does your oversight include hunting trophies killed in other countries and then brought back to the United States?
Absolutely. So as I said, anything that is alive, dead, a part, or a product. So you have your personal pet or your commercial shipment of fish that are live, doing well, we regulate that. If you have a part of a dead animal for whatever reason, if you have a, I want to say a fur jacket, if you have a set of trophy antlers, if you have that fancy exotic leather Italian boot that you've always wanted, that's all regulated by Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So if everyone could put your hands together for Bonnie Kelley.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.